above the water. The Trump administration saying Maduro and his wife were taken from their heavily fortified compound. The president says as they were rushing toward their safe room. The president said Maduro was captured before he could close the door to the safe room. That whole operation lasting roughly 2.5 hours. Overnight, President Trump again saying, quote, "We're in charge of Venezuela," that the U.S. is in charge of Venezuela. Maduro's hand-picked vice president, meanwhile, Delcy Rodriguez, has been sworn in now as that nation's acting president. She's condemning the U.S. operation and demanding Maduro's return. However, President Trump has also said that behind the scenes she is cooperating after he earlier warned she would, quote, "pay a very big price if she did not." Even worse than Maduro, he suggested. Sources now telling ABC News top congressional leaders will be briefed today by several Trump administration officials, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Attorney General Pam Bondi about this high-stakes operation to capture Maduro. Lawmakers on both sides with questions about how the president now plans to, quote, "run Venezuela." There's also bipartisan concerns we've been reporting on here. Congress did not authorize the use of military force in Venezuela. Secretary of State Rubio suggesting over the weekend that that was not necessary. There are also serious questions about how the U.S. plans to control Venezuela's oil industry. The president has clearly said on the world stage that he wants American oil companies to now move in quickly to rebuild the oil infrastructure. Venezuela, of course, a key ally of Russia and China. It sits on the largest supply of oil reserves in the world. In an interview with ABC News back in 2019, Maduro claimed that, quote, "Donald Trump wants a war for oil." Let's get right back to the live pictures. Federal court in Manhattan. Aaron Katersky is inside the courthouse. He has already sent out his first note here, the scene in the courtroom. He said the marshals inspected the armchairs, the mahogany defense table where Maduro will sit. Security, as you can see, outside the courthouse, but also inside very tight. Metal barricades stretching the length of the courthouse and beyond on both sides of Worth Street in Lower Manhattan. A K-9 unit has been seen roaming the halls outside. Dueling protest groups separated by the NYPD. And we have just learned here that Nicolas Maduro has been escorted into courtroom 26A in shackles. He's wearing tan pants, a black smock over an orange T-shirt, orange jail slippers. His wife, Aaron Katersky, reporting in, is 2 seats away in this courtroom. Obviously, no cameras in court. This is federal court, but we're getting reporting from inside the courthouse at this hour from Aaron Katersky. Judge Alvin Hellerstein has just taken the bench. This arraignment is not expected to last terribly long unless something unforeseen plays out here. As we await details coming in from this courtroom, let's go to Dan Abrams, our chief legal analyst. And Dan, we expect a series of narco-terrorism-related charges here this morning that the judge will go down the list.
Right. Narco-terrorism conspiracy and cocaine importation conspiracy are the 2 most serious charges. There's also some weapons charges as well. And when I say serious, we're talking about maximum of up to life in prison with minimums of 20 and 10 years. Now, if you look at this big picture, what the government is alleging is that Maduro and his wife used the government of Venezuela to execute on this drug conspiracy. They literally were handing out passports to drug dealers. They were engaging in murder and kidnapping, using the diplomacy, using the veil of the Venezuelan government to pursue this drug conspiracy. And that's the heart of everything that they're alleging here. Remember, this started in 2020, where the first indictment was handed up, and they have now handed up a superseding indictment in connection with this. And so in court, as you pointed out, we're expecting this to be relatively brief. They'll be informed of the charges against them. There may be some discussion of whether there would be bail, which, of course, would be a non-issue in a case like this. And remember, 2 separate cases against Maduro and his wife. There could be different evidence. There could be separate trials. A lot of things we still don't know at this point.
Dan, when you talk about separate trials, it could be a very long time before we see any of these trials begin.
It could be years. In a typical case like this, it could take years. Now, we'll have to see if this gets expedited. Remember, that is something that belongs to the defendant in most cases, right? The power to move things forward. A defendant has a right to a speedy trial. If a defendant wants the case to move forward quickly, that defendant can help in moving that process forward. So if Maduro and his wife decide we don't want this to take months and months and months. We want to get this going in 60 days, 3 months, et cetera. They could try to push forward with a case, but I would expect that this will at least take a number of months, if not much longer.
And if convicted, you mentioned this earlier, what does Maduro face here?
Up to life in prison, and with minimums of 10 and 20 years just on the most serious charges, right? I mean, then you've got additional charges as well. So, if he's convicted here, you're talking about, effectively a life sentence for him, you would think. We'll see. The judge will have enormous discretion when it comes to sentencing. There's always the possibility that he's not convicted of the most serious charges. Again, as we talked about a moment ago, there could be a different case against his wife. And so as a result, his wife might not be convicted of certain charges. They might not be convicted of anything. We shall see. But when it comes to sentencing, the judge has enormous discretion in a case like this.
Dan Abrams, stay with us here for our live coverage. The arraignment of Nicolas Maduro playing out in New York City in federal court. Here in Lower Manhattan, the pictures you see, intense security outside that courtroom. Inside, Aaron Katersky, our chief investigative correspondent, describing a very similar scene. Very heavy security inside that courthouse, a K-9 unit in the hallways. We have just learned that Nicolas Maduro and his wife are both wearing headphones inside that courtroom to listen to the interpreter. These headphones obviously provided by the court. Maduro has taken his seat next to his defense attorney, Barry Polak, and immediately began writing on a notepad. His wife is seated next to her attorney, Mark Donnelly. Apparently, she has her hands folded on the table. Judge Alvin Hellerstein introducing himself and saying he would assure a fair processing. That's my job, he said. That is my intent. And when he says a fair proceeding here, he's talking about an arraignment on these charges, a description of these charges, Dan. He will describe what both Maduro and his wife face.
Correct. They will be informed of the charges against them. That's really the point of this proceeding. This is not supposed to be particularly substantive. This is not where he begins to present a defense. This is basically to start the process moving forward. This is, you show up in court, you're informed of what you're charged with, and now the process begins.
Dan Abrams, our chief legal correspondent, stay with us here. I want to bring in Martha Raddatz, who's also following these breaking developments here. ABC News live coverage of Nicolas Maduro and his wife now being arraigned on narco-terrorism charges. Dan listing the charges here just moments ago, both inside that courtroom wearing headphones to listen to what it is they face here now in the U.S. Martha, you've had extensive reporting of this U.S. military operation. We heard the president when he came out afterwards and first addressed the nation on this, saying that Nicolas Maduro and his wife were captured as they tried to get to that safe room on their compound. He said it was within moments of closing the door they got him before he could close the door behind him. What an extraordinary shifting of scenes here. Now he's inside this federal courthouse, shackled.
Astonishing, from a presidential compound to a seat in a courtroom in New York. Really an astonishing development. And what is even more astonishing is that military operation, as you know, David, a tactical success. It seemed to be a flawless operation, but there were bloody gun battles. We are learning, the Cubans say 32 Cubans were killed. Now, the Cubans were doing security for Maduro, so it is likely, we know there was gunfire when the U.S. elite Delta Force approached that compound, got near Maduro. There was gunfire that broke out. 32 Cubans apparently killed in that. And Donald Trump has now revealed that the Americans who were wounded were helicopter pilots. We saw those helicopters going over Caracas. They had flown over the waters at about 100 feet, those dark waters arriving, and there was gunfire apparently then. Now, some of those helicopters and some of the other warplanes overhead providing support took out air defenses, but apparently some of those helicopter pilots were hit. They managed to keep flying the helicopters. President Trump said they were bleeding badly, but still kept on. We don't know exactly whether those were gunshot wounds or shrapnel, perhaps, from the helicopter getting hit, but they were able to keep flying those helicopters. When they approached Maduro and his wife, they gave up. according to President Trump, on their way to try to get behind those steel doors. But I can tell you, David, even if they'd gotten behind those steel doors, the Delta Force could have gotten them out of there. They would have blasted their way in through those doors and breached those heavy steel doors, because they had practice on an exact replica of that compound. That compound was within a military installation, but they had been following. A CIA team on the ground knew exactly where they were, where they had gone, and that's why they built a replica, the Delta Force, and were practicing for months in breaching this this compound, David.
Near universal praise for members of the U.S. military in carrying out that very dangerous operation. And of course, the tough questions now come afterward, and not for the U.S. military, but instead for the Trump administration on how we move forward, given the fact that, again, overnight, President Trump has said that the U.S. is in control of Venezuela. We heard Secretary of State Marco Rubio in the last 24 hours, in particular on the Sunday shows here in the U.S., trying to dial back, if you will, some of that rhetoric, saying we'll apply pressure on Venezuela, the embargo on the oil tankers, in addition to other steps taken by the U.S. military and the presence that still very much remains in that region. Secretary Rubio saying that pressure would push Venezuela in a direction that the U.S. would determine whether or not they were listening and following along, and whether or not the U.S. military would have to indeed take any kind of secondary action here. The president clearly said again last night, though, that instead the U.S. is simply in charge now. In this courtroom, you're looking at federal court here in Manhattan, where ousted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, captured by the U.S. military over the weekend, is shackled, sitting in court, wearing a pair of headphones provided by the court. So is his wife, sitting not far from him in that courtroom. We now know that Maduro stood before the judge. Are you, sir, Nicolas Maduro Mores? The judge asking. Maduro declared through an interpreter, I am the president of Venezuela. He said, I was captured at my home in Caracas, Venezuela, before the judge interrupted and told him there would be time later to challenge his custody. Maduro then affirmed he is who the judge said he is, which was, of course, the initial question. Also an extraordinary development. Our chief international correspondent, James Longman, in the region on the border of Venezuela. And when you hear Nicolas Maduro, James, immediately try to take an opportunity to establish before that court that he remains the president of Venezuela. I was captured in Caracas at my home before the judge interrupted him and said, you'll have your chance to make your case later.
Yeah, David, and that goes to the heart of this, because in many senses, nothing has really changed inside Venezuela. Yes, we had the theater and the drama of his capture, but his regime remains. And that is why there is so much uncertainty about this situation. I'm here in Colombia on the border with Venezuela in Cúcuta. You can see a massive Colombian military presence here. They are terrified about this situation spiraling out of control, and we see a massive migration crisis fueled by Donald Trump's intervention on Friday. Goes against precisely one of the things that elected Donald Trump in the first place, which was a vow to stop mass migration. So that has got to be one of the massive concerns here in Colombia. Anyway, I want to take you across here because you can see it's very busy. This road is open as usual because every day tens of thousands of Venezuelans cross over to go shopping. Goods are much cheaper on this side of the border than they are in Venezuela. Massive inflation makes life just much more difficult for the average Venezuelan. And I just want to walk you through. Venezuelans we speak to, every single one of them, without exception, says they're happy that Maduro is gone. That's really important to say, but it is not the whole picture because they're conscious that the rest of the regime remains. I just spoke to one man who actually, we stood on this bridge here and he cried in front of me, saying he's not sure if he's ever going to see his sons again. But he was very, very circumspect. He didn't want to go into too much detail because he knows Maduro's regime lives on. David.
James Longman with the picture there on the Venezuelan border, and James making an important point here, which is that inside Venezuela, at least according to the government, Maduro is still the rightful president. The acting president saying we await Maduro's return. And in fact, Maduro's son, who is also part of this indictment, speaking before the National Assembly there, saying his father was a good father and he looks forward to his return to Venezuela. You're looking live again, ABC News live coverage here of the arraignment on these charges, narco-terrorism charges in federal court, heavy security presence both inside and outside the court, as you can see. Because this is federal court, there are no cameras in the courtroom, but Aaron Katursky is inside, our chief investigative correspondent, with Nicolas Maduro standing. Aaron now reports that Judge Hellerstein read him the standard rights. I did not know of these rights. Your Honor is informing me of them now, Maduro said through an interpreter. How do you plead to the indictment, Hellerstein asked. That's the judge, of course. And here's Maduro's response. Quote, I am innocent. I am not guilty. I am a decent man. I am still president of my country. Nicolas Maduro responding again. That is the headline of the moment here, given our live coverage, that Nicolas Maduro has responded in court to these charges just moments ago, saying, quote, I am innocent. I am not guilty. I'm a decent man. I am still president of my country. Dan Abrams.
Yeah, so not a surprise. The interesting thing that I was looking for was how much is Maduro going to try and give a speech in connection with this arraignment? And as you mentioned before, the judge cut him off. The judge said, that's not for right now. All you need to do right now is say that you understand what the charges are against you. He's pleading not guilty, and that's all. He'll have his chance to present his defense. He'll have his chance to get out there publicly if he so chooses with what his defense will be. But that's not the place for it right now. And as a result, we expect that this hearing will be pretty short. So we'll just have to see exactly how short it's going to be.
Dan Abrams, our chief legal analyst, with us here this afternoon. Dan, thank you. I want to bring in Rachel Scott into the conversation. She's at the White House for us. And Rachel, no question, the White House watching these proceedings unfold likely very closely here this morning as well. And we know that the White House also faces questions in addition to the charges that Maduro is facing. Obviously, these are drug trafficking charges. These are not charges related to the oil industry, although President Trump has repeatedly said that Venezuela took money, billions of dollars in oil revenue from the U.S., and he says that U.S. companies will now go into Venezuela, rebuild the infrastructure, help get Venezuela back on track. The president again last night, Rachel, declaring that the U.S. is in charge of Venezuela.
Yes, David, and that came after those conflicting statements from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. In the immediate aftermath of this capture, we heard the president come before the American people and say that the United States is now going to run Venezuela. He even pointed to the people who were standing behind him. You could see them in this photo right here. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and then Secretary of State Marco Rubio goes on television. He does a series of media interviews in which he says and tries to dial this back a little bit, saying that the United States is going to be running policy in Venezuela, and also saying that they will be using this oil blockade that is currently going on as leverage over the country. Then we saw the president on Air Force One make it very clear. He said flat out, point blank, the United States is now in charge of Venezuela. But there are still major questions today about what exactly that means. The president has not ruled out American troops going on the ground in Venezuela. He said in a response to a question about that, it depends on what exactly happens with the government. And then we heard that threat directly to Maduro's vice president, Rodriguez, saying that if she does not do what the United States wants her to do, then in fact, she could face a worse outcome than Maduro. That was a threat from the president there. So there's still a lot of questions here, David, on exactly how this is going to play out, and not a ton of answers on from the United States on exactly what happens on the ground in Venezuela when it comes to the United States involvement in that area, David.
Again, you're looking at live pictures. Rachel, thank you. Lower Manhattan federal court. Nicolas Maduro, the ousted president captured by the U.S. military over the weekend of Venezuela, saying in court, I am innocent. I am not guilty. I am a decent man. I am still president of my country. He said, I am not guilty of anything mentioned here. responding through an interpreter inside that courtroom when asked to repeat his plea to the charges. Judge Hellerstein then turning to Maduro's wife, also in that courtroom. We told you moments ago that they're sitting not far from one another. Both are wearing headsets so that they can hear through an interpreter what is being said to them by this judge. Judge Hellerstein turning to the wife, she says, "I am Cilia Flores. I am the First Lady of the Republic of Venezuela." The judge interjecting, saying the purpose today is just to ask you who you are, also taken into custody by the U.S. military as they tried to get into that safe room. Asked how she pleaded to the 3 counts of the indictment she faces, Cilia Flores responding, "Not guilty, completely innocent." So we've heard responses now from Nicolas Maduro saying, "I am innocent, I am not guilty, I'm a decent man," and declaring that I am still president of my country. And now Cilia Flores, his wife, saying that she also is not guilty, completely innocent. She interjected, "I am First Lady of the Republic of Venezuela," but the judge then reminding her that the purpose today is to simply ask you who you are. Matt Rivers, who has covered South America extensively. He is in Bogota, Colombia for us. And as we stay trained on this courtroom in New York, Matt, your reaction here to what's playing out inside this courtroom, the president of Venezuela, the First Lady of Venezuela, both declaring their innocence here.
It's stunning, quite frankly. I'm personally not surprised that both Maduro and his wife tried to interject, tried to make their case a little bit there in court. Maduro, if nothing else, is a showman, and he knows very much right now that he is on the world stage in a way that he never has been before. But frankly, it is stunning that just a few days ago, he was running the country of Venezuela as he had for well over a decade, and now he is in a New York courtroom, David. It's something that I think the people of Venezuela are still struggling to even grasp, even fathom, because for better or for worse, Maduro was Venezuela. Internationally, he symbolized Venezuela. He was a larger-than-life figure for so many people in that country, and the swiftness, the suddenness, the brazenness of that attack, and the fact that they were able to extract Maduro from that country, I don't know that that's really sunk in for a lot of Venezuelans yet, as they grasp not only the U.S. doing that and what that means for their country in that moment, but also the future for Venezuela here, David. There is so much confusion, a lack of clarity about what the United States plans to do with that country and how that will affect the everyday people that have been, frankly, brutalized by the Maduro regime for a very long time.
And a question for you, Matt. Obviously, these charges are drug-related, narco-terrorism-related charges. But as you know, the questions in the aftermath of this U.S. military operation involved the oil largely. President Trump on the world stage clearly saying that the U.S. will move in quickly. U.S. companies will rebuild the infrastructure and recoup some of the money. And he said billions of dollars were lost to Venezuela in the last several decades, after the infrastructure was allowed to weaken, and with Maduro in power, claiming that the U.S. lost money. But the world fully aware of the relationship between Venezuela and China and Russia, and where that oil typically goes, President Trump now declaring the U.S. is in charge of Venezuela.
No question about that, David, and I think the geopolitics of all of this really matter. Of course, President Trump wants to control the world's largest supply of oil, across the entire world. But he also wants to keep it out of the hands of China and Russia. China is the largest purchaser right now of Venezuelan oil, and President Trump has been very clear. He does not like that. He doesn't like the presence that China has in the Western Hemisphere. He is very open about the fact that he wants that oil sold inside the United States and to friendly nations around the world. It's not just oil and what it represents for the economy. It's also being used as a strategic tool in the game of great powers that is playing out between the United States and China at this very moment. So that is certainly part of the strategy here from the United States moving forward, as President Trump wants to get those U.S. oil companies back where they were for so many decades.
Matt Rivers, who has covered the region for quite a few years for us. Matt, we appreciate it. He is live in Colombia. We'll go back to him as necessary. And again, the breaking news here in New York City, coming to us from Aaron Katersky inside the federal courthouse here. Both Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, standing in that courtroom when called upon by the judge asking them if they understand the charges and asking if they can confirm who they are, summarizing the charges for them. Maduro standing, Judge Hellerstein reading him the standard rights. And Nicolas Maduro responding, "I did not know of these rights. Your Honor is informing me of them right now," he said. And then he was asked by the judge, "How do you plead to the indictment?" And again, as I mentioned, Nicolas Maduro declaring in that courtroom, but in essence for the world, watching not only here in the U.S., but around the world, these proceedings as they play out. Nicolas Maduro saying, "I am innocent, I am not guilty, I'm a decent man." And as I mentioned before, declaring that I'm still the president of my country. It was not long after Cilia Flores standing in that courtroom as well, and she went on to say, "I am the First Lady of the Republic of Venezuela," which is when the judge interjected, saying the purpose today is to simply ask you who you are. Then a familiar scene playing out with her as well, the judge explaining to her her rights to remain silent, to be represented by an attorney. She said, "Yes, I understand this, I've heard this." And then when asked how she pleads to the 3 counts of the indictment that she faces, Cilia Flores responding, "Not guilty, completely innocent." Martha Raddatz, we know there are proceedings playing out across town at the UN and the UN Security Council meeting to discuss the unfolding events in Venezuela, and you have new reporting?
Exactly. Just before these court proceedings started, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz, said he was an illegitimate so-called president. He said Maduro was not a head of state and emphasized that over 50 countries rejected the legitimacy of Maduro's reelection following the disputed 2024 election. He also said, and this adds to those mixed messages we are getting from the administration, with Donald Trump saying we are running the country, talking about possible boots on the ground, that they're not afraid to put boots on the ground. Mike Waltz just said that the U.S. is not occupying a country, calling the U.S.'s actions a law enforcement operation. He said his Secretary Rubio has said there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not, again saying we are not occupying a country, again saying this is law enforcement. The United States arrested a narco trafficker. But as we've heard, the president again reiterated that he believes we are now in charge of that country. Waltz also did add that the U.S. would not allow, as Matt was saying, would not allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. And as you know, David, there have been threats to other countries as well from President Trump, Colombia, Mexico, Greenland, and what the U.S. may do in those countries. David.
Our chief foreign correspondent, our chief global affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, with us here this afternoon as well. Martha, thank you. Just in from the courtroom, and in the moment that Aaron Katursky is allowed to leave this proceeding, he'll come out before the camera for us and give us color from inside that court. This is not expected to be a terribly long proceeding, though the color has been quite something coming from the courtroom. Right now, we are learning that the judge informing both Maduro and his wife, the First Lady, as citizens of the state of Venezuela, you have the right to consult with consular officials. We understand it, and we would like to have such visits, Nicolas Maduro answered. He took notes during the proceeding, Nicolas Maduro did, and he asked the judge for permission to keep those notes. He did not ask for bail. Mr. Maduro is not seeking release at this time, is what his defense attorney, Barry Pollock, said inside that courtroom. Cilia Flores, likewise, not seeking bail inside that courtroom. The judge did, however, make it very clear that he's open to receiving a bail application in the future, but that the couple will otherwise remain detained at MDC Brooklyn, which is a jail detention facility not far away in terms of distance from this federal courthouse, though the way they had to get them to the courthouse was somewhat dramatic here this morning, being taken heavily fortified vehicles and then flown to the island of Manhattan and then brought to the federal courthouse in multiple steps here this morning. These are the pictures that we witnessed around 8 a.m. this morning as they were brought from Brooklyn to Manhattan by helicopter, and then from the motorcade waiting for them to bring them into that courthouse. Significant security outside the courthouse this morning. There have been protests. There are signs on both sides weighing in with different opinions on Nicolas Maduro being removed from power and the way in which this played out. As Martha mentioned, a remarkable U.S. military operation, one where there has been praise for simply being able to pull this off, the size and scope of this, how dangerous it was, and yet no loss of U.S. life. We did learn that a couple of pilots, according to Martha, were injured, but then still able to fly to leave the operation and to get through it 2.5 hours in total. And that Nicolas Maduro and his wife were captured in those final moments as they tried to get into their safe room, their safe house within the presidential compound. They weren't even allowed to have enough time to get that door closed, though President Trump, in speaking to the nation, made it very clear, even if they had closed that door, that it would have been a matter of seconds, that team on the ground that had studied that compound for quite some time in advance of this operation would have been able to blow their way through that door to capture Nicolas Maduro. Also coming in from the courtroom moments ago, Nicolas Maduro's defense attorney signaling the ousted Venezuelan leader may try to assert that he is entitled to protection from prosecution. Here's what the defense attorney said. This is the attorney for Nicolas Maduro moments ago saying, quote, of Maduro, he is the head of a sovereign state, adding that there are, quote, issues about the legality of his military abduction. Calling this a military abduction. The attorney for the First Lady of Venezuela said that she was injured during the military operation and that she has requested a medical briefing, that Cilia Flores has requested a medical briefing saying she was injured during the U.S. military operation. This is the quote from her attorney, quote, she sustained significant injuries. There's worry she may have a fracture or severe bruising on her ribs, according to her attorney inside that courtroom. The next date is March 17th. They've already been given the next date here, 11 a.m. in this very courtroom. The court has been adjourned. I'm told right now that Nicolas Maduro is being escorted out. I don't believe we're going to see him again. I think what we saw this morning was the extent of what we'll see, but the moment we see any movement on the ground here, of course, we'll bring that to you. We also know that Aaron Katersky, our chief investigative correspondent, who was inside the courtroom as all of this played out, he'll be in front of the camera just moments from now to provide color from inside the courtroom. But again, court has been adjourned. Nicolas Maduro being escorted out of that courtroom inside the federal court here in Manhattan. Both he and his wife will be returned to that detention facility. Unclear if his wife will receive this medical briefing and how quickly. It's fairly likely she will. Unclear whether that will just play out as well at that detention center in Brooklyn. Dan Abrams also following this, our live coverage with us here, watching this unfold. And not surprising, really, Dan, to either one of us how quickly this unfolded here this morning.
No, not surprising. Interesting, though, that he's now preparing to challenge his abduction, which is an interesting question, right? Because there are real arguments that as a matter of international law, the U.S. should not have been able to simply go in and grab Maduro. Now, the position of the government is it was a law enforcement operation, that the military was just helping to back it up. That may be a tough legal argument, but now that it's done, it's going to be very hard for Maduro to say, well, they shouldn't have been able to take me. Why would it be so hard? Because he was indicted. I mean, he was a wanted fugitive, in essence. So even if you were to believe, yeah, the government shouldn't have been able to go in and do that, I can't see how they would reverse that now and say, yeah, you can go back even though he has been indicted in a United States court. So it's going to be an interesting legal debate, but I don't think it's going to be particularly dispositive.
Dan Abrams with us here this morning. Aaron Katersky has just made his way outside the courthouse into a microphone. And Aaron, your notes were extraordinarily helpful here. As Dan and I were just talking about, quite something to hear that Nicolas Maduro will likely claim that there are issues, legal issues, about his military abduction. And he declared in that courtroom through his attorney that he remains the head of a sovereign state.
He did, David. He said, I am the president. I am still the president of the Republic of Venezuela. His wife, Cilia Flores, likewise said that she is the first lady of the Republic of Venezuela. And defense attorney Barry Pollock signaled that he will challenge the circumstances of Maduro's capture by the U.S. military. This is a tactic that Manuel Noriega tried when he was found to have surrendered to U.S. forces in Panama back in 1990. It did not work in the U.S. courts then. It may not work now, but he will certainly try. But the U.S. just doesn't recognize Maduro as a legitimate president. He certainly does. And as he stood before Judge Alvin Hellerstein a short while ago, he declared himself, "I am Nicolas Maduro. I am innocent. I am not guilty. I am the president of Venezuela."
It did seem from the notes that you shared with us from inside the courtroom, Aaron, that the judge signaled fairly early on here that there would not be time for speeches, that will come in due time through their defense, that he was simply asking for them to confirm who they are, that they understand the charges against them, and ask them their plea. That both when Nicolas Maduro spoke and when Cilia Flores spoke, the judge interjecting essentially in so many words saying this is not the time and place for that.
Exactly right, David. The judge did not want this to turn into any kind of a spectacle, and he wanted to keep this as ordinary as is possible, despite the extraordinary circumstances of how Nicolas Maduro got here. He is now being treated like every other criminal defendant in the dock here at Manhattan Federal Court. David, as the judge asked Maduro to affirm, he appeared to be prepared to go off on a lengthy speech declaring himself the rightful president of Venezuela, challenging why he was even here in the first place, and the judge just was not going to let him do it, at least at this stage. He said he would entertain motions in the future, and Maduro does not have to be back in court until March 17th. In the meantime, he is going to be detained at MDC Brooklyn, the decrepit federal jail where every other defendant awaiting trial here at Manhattan Federal Court is held. David, the defense said they would not challenge Maduro's detention at this point, although the judge said they have the opportunity to try and do that in the future.
Describe for me, if you will, Aaron, the scene inside that courtroom. They were both brought in. I know they were both shackled, brought to their chairs, seated not far from one another. Was there any sort of communication, even a glance between Nicolas Maduro and his wife sitting not far from him in that courtroom? How did this play out?
It did not appear that Maduro and his wife looked at one another, but they were seated with just a lawyer between them. And at one point, when the judge informed them of their right to be in contact with consular services, with someone from the Venezuelan consulate here in New York, Maduro answered for both of them and said, "We would like to take advantage of those consular services." But otherwise, it did not appear that Maduro and his wife interacted at all. Maduro was brought in first wearing beige pants, a black smock over an orange T-shirt, and orange jail slippers. He was escorted to a chair that the U.S. Marshals had flipped over to inspect. We've seen that before for high-profile defendants. They flipped over all the chairs at the defense table before Maduro was seated. His wife was then brought in next, wearing a very similar outfit, beige pants, black smock, orange T-shirt, took her place, kept her arms folded on the table, whereas Maduro himself took notes almost through the entire proceeding, and at the very end, he asked the judge for permission to make a request that he keep those notes, and the judge said that he could.
Aaron, as all of this was playing out, Nicolas Maduro's son, who is also under indictment, though he remains in Venezuela, speaking to the National Assembly there, where he's been a lawmaker for about 4 years now, since 2021. And in a message to his father in front of the Venezuelan people, he said, "Dad, you created a strong family. The nation is in good hands while we await your return. I love you." That was the message from his son. There's the picture of the National Assembly there in Venezuela. Certainly, from the standpoint of the words that he used, somewhat hopeful that he'll see his father one day soon in Venezuela. But given the proceeding here today in Lower Manhattan, a stark reminder that is unlikely to happen. And in fact, the earliest we might see these trials begin could be some time from now, Aaron.
Oh, it could be months, if not a year or longer, David, before Nicolas Maduro ever stands trial on this 4-count indictment to which he, in rather dramatic fashion, pleaded not guilty. Rather than just say not guilty, he attempted something of a soliloquy saying, I am innocent, I am not guilty, I am a decent man, I am still president of my country, before the judge cut him off and simply said a plea of not guilty would be entered on his behalf. And Nicolas Maduro is going nowhere but back to jail in Brooklyn. He arrived here under heavy guard, David. There is still metal barricades and fencing stretching the length of the courthouse and beyond as protesters come here to the courthouse, some even cheering when Maduro, it was realized, had pleaded not guilty to those charges. Half the protesters are against what the United States military did, and other protesters are here saying this was the right thing to do, and the NYPD is keeping both groups apart.
Our chief investigative correspondent, Aaron Katursky, who was inside that courtroom today. We do have our chopper up in the air from WABC here in New York over the facility, should we see any of the movements here of Nicolas Maduro. There you can see the scene. We're not expected to see him like we did this morning around 8 a.m. and that carefully planned trip from Brooklyn, the detention center where he's being held, to Manhattan to get him to this federal courthouse, he and Cilia Flores, the First Lady of Venezuela. But our chopper up in the air, and as soon as we see any movement here, we'll bring it to you. But in the meantime, I just want to get to the bottom line here, the breaking news this afternoon. Not only the U.S. watching this, but the world. Nicolas Maduro, the ousted Venezuelan president in that U.S. military operation over the weekend, now declaring in federal court in Manhattan, quote, I am innocent, I am not guilty, I'm a decent man, I am still president of my country. His attorney in that courtroom signaling which direction they may go now, questioning the legality they believe of this U.S. military operation. Cilia Flores then asked if she in fact is Cilia Flores. She said, I am the First Lady of the Republic of Venezuela. The judge interjecting, saying the purpose today is to simply ask you who you are. He explained to her her rights. She said, yes, I understand them. And she went on to declare her innocence in federal court here in the U.S. as well. Our coverage will continue on ABC News Live, abcnews.com. We're going to return to local programming. If there are any major developments, I'll be back on the air with the team. But we'll definitely be back with the entire team for World News Tonight. I'm David Muir in New York. I'll see you then. Good day.
And you've been watching an ABC News special report as ousted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores are now officially charged in the U.S. with narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons offenses. Standing before the judge, Maduro said, quote, I am innocent, I am a decent man, I am still president of my country. They both face life in prison if convicted. And while that arraignment unfolded in Lower Manhattan, the United Nations Security Council held an emergency meeting at UN headquarters in Midtown Manhattan amid growing concerns of instability in Venezuela. Meanwhile, President Trump says the U.S. is now in charge of Venezuela and seems to be warning other countries could be next. Let's go straight to ABC's Rena Roy outside the courthouse. Rena, what's the latest from court?
Yeah, well, Diane, this was a brief hearing today here in federal court behind us. We know that Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, they were listening in on the hearing through headphones, listening through a translator, and they also spoke through an interpreter as well. And Nicolas Maduro said, I'm an innocent man. He pleaded not guilty. He said, I am the president of Venezuela. I am still the president of Venezuela. His wife pleaded not guilty as well. They both did not ask for bail, so they will be taken right back to the MDC in Brooklyn where they came from this morning. And Diane, it seems like they really had a lot to say. They wanted to speak, but the judge sort of cut them off and said this hearing today will be brief. So Diane, for now, the next court date has been scheduled for March 17th.
And let's bring in Chief Investigative Correspondent Aaron Katursky, who is inside that courtroom. Aaron, tell us what you saw.
Nicolas Maduro walked into a silent courtroom wearing beige pants, a black smock over an orange T-shirt, orange jail slippers on his feet, and he was shackled as he was led to the defense table. The U.S. Marshals had already flipped over the chair to inspect it. He took his seat and almost immediately began scribbling notes, and at the end of the proceeding, he wanted to make sure he could keep them. The judge said that he could. His wife was not far behind him. Cilia Flores, wearing a very similar outfit, kept her hands folded on the defense table, and the proceeding was relatively quick, meant to not only read the couple their rights, but also to take pleas. And Nicolas Maduro and his wife each entered not guilty pleas, but they did so in rather dramatic fashion. Nicolas Maduro declaring Diane, I am innocent, I am not guilty, I am a decent man, I am still president of my country. Judge Alvin Hellerstein at that point cut him off, said there would be time for him to challenge the circumstances of his detention and his capture, but he simply wanted to find out what his plea was to this 4-count indictment that accuses Maduro of leading a 25-year narco-terrorism conspiracy.
And ABC News legal analyst Brian Buckmeyer is here with some analysis on this. Brian, Maduro and Flores didn't request bail. What does that tell you, and what happens to them now as they await trial?
So when it comes to requesting bail, at least in this concept, I think it follows into two different theories. The first being, some might hear this oftentimes, you want to measure twice, cut once. And what I mean by that is, think of the context of Barry Pollock meeting his now client, Maduro. He just met him a few, maybe minutes, hours ago. There's not enough time, at least in his eyes, to have an interview with his client, see what resources that can be put together to create a bail package that he believes the judge might entertain to some degree. Yes, are we all saying a bail is a long shot? Absolutely, but if you're going to make that long shot, you do it as best as you can. The other issue is the standards and arguments for setting bail the first time and then trying to get another judge to change a previous judge's ruling on bail is slightly different. You don't want to be in a position where you're going to a second judge and saying, hey, the first judge made a mistake at setting bail. Here's why the first judge made a mistake, and here's additional information. It's a second hill to climb, and that much harder. You try to get it right the first time.
And let's go to senior political correspondent Rachel Scott at the White House. Rachel, Venezuela's interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, is calling for dialogue now with the U.S. after initially calling this operation an atrocity. So what's the latest there on those conversations, and what's next for Venezuela?
And Diane, it is notable now what Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president, who is currently serving as the interim president of Venezuela, has said, because that follows what President Trump said. He told reporters on Air Force One that if she does not comply with what the United States wants her to do, that she could suffer consequences and a fate that is worse than Nicolas Maduro, who, as we know and see here, is now going to be behind bars in U.S. custody on U.S. soil. And so then we saw that change in tone from her. Initially, in her initial statement, she came out and she defended Maduro. She called for his immediate release. And so it will be a very big question now about how Rodriguez acts in the next couple of days, and also a question for this administration on why they believe they can trust Rodriguez, who was working so closely with Maduro, if this government, if the Trump administration did not even recognize Nicolas Maduro as a legitimate president of Venezuela. And so there are major questions to put forward to the administration, including the details of how exactly the Trump administration and the United States now plans to run Venezuela, a country of more than 31 million people. We still have not really gotten the answers to a lot of those questions. We have sort of heard this shifting conversation between Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that the United States is going to be running policy versus the president, who said point blank, flat out, that the United States is now in charge. And so certainly a lot of questions for this White House, for the president, as well as top Trump administration officials about what exactly is going to happen in the coming days, as the focus now evolves from whether or not this was a successful operation, which of course it was, to whether or not this is actually going to be a successful strategy for the people of Venezuela and also for the United States.
Yeah, and that focus is also shifting to who could maybe be next. President Trump has talked about the leader of Colombia, Colombia's president, implying that maybe that country and that leader could be next here. I want to go to ABC's Matt Rivers, who's in Bogota, Colombia, and has also been speaking to people in Venezuela. Matt, walk me through the reaction both in Venezuela and across the border in Colombia, given what President Trump has said, and also just your reaction to hearing Maduro saying that he is innocent, he's a decent man, and he's still the president of Venezuela.
You know, Diane, it doesn't surprise me that he tried to use that moment to make some sort of declaration like that. Maduro is a showman. There's no question about that. And I'm waiting for that trial where he will take whatever opportunity he can get to make a scene like that. That is what he's going to do, and he's going to stick to that line, that he is still president, that this was unjust. That's going to be what he says without question. He is not president effectively of Venezuela anymore, though. We know that Delcy Rodriguez, his former vice president, was sworn in as the leader of Venezuela this morning in what was a show of support at the National Congress there in Caracas. You saw lots of Congress people there supporting, at least nominally, Maduro. You saw his son speak and address the assembly there. So, collectively, his government is still in place. One man does not make a government, and that government is still functioning. The United States and President Trump might say that the U.S. is in charge of Venezuela right now. That is not actually the case. Maduro's government is still in charge. What is very different, though, is how that government is going to react. What is different is the United States applying maximum pressure and leverage on the sitting government to make sure they do as they're told. That is what we expect to happen moving forward with this pressure campaign from the United States. And it will be very interesting to see what Delcy Rodriguez and her government do. Do they do enough to placate the United States to avoid more military action, or do they remain defiant? We heard a statement from Rodriguez over the weekend where she came out and sort of changed her tone, and she said, look, we want to work with the United States. It was an olive branch statement talking about shared development between the two countries, wanting peace. So that is a step toward cooperation with the U.S., but how far is Rodriguez and her government willing to go to placate Donald Trump?
And we are keeping an eye on that movement outside that courthouse where Nicolas Maduro and his wife just appeared, both pleading not guilty to these drug charges. I want to bring in ABC News contributor, former chairman of the U.S. House Homeland Security Committee and former federal prosecutor John Katko. John, the next court date is March 17th. What do you think the next steps are, and how soon could we actually see this trial get started?
Well, the next step is whether there's going to be any additional pretrial hearings. They don't have to wait for a preliminary hearing because he's already been indicted. So the next hearing will probably be just to kind of set the schedule for the trial. But there's something called the discovery phase where they're going to spend a tremendous amount of time getting discovery to the defendant, all the information, all the evidence that they have against him. And then the defendant's going to have to take a lot of time to digest it all. So I don't see a trial coming anytime soon. Cases like these are very complicated. When I did them, it was very, very rare for a trial to go sooner than 6 months to a year after the person is apprehended. And that's a kind of an aggressive schedule in and of itself. So there's a lot more to be done here. There probably will be a detention hearing at some point, unless he's waived detention or reserved. But the discovery issues are going to be lengthy and they're going to be complicated. And there's going to be a lot of motions coming from the defense as well. And they'll throw everything they can at the prosecution to try and slow things down and gum things up.
And we are following the motorcade now as we believe that armored vehicle has President Maduro, former President Maduro, inside as they leave the courthouse in Manhattan and now head back to a Brooklyn jail where he and his wife, Cilia Flores, will be held. I want to bring in senior national policy reporter Ann Flaherty. And as this hearing was happening, the UN Security Council is also holding this emergency meeting. We also heard U.S. Ambassador Mike Waltz a little bit earlier addressing the council, defending this operation. So how are other countries there responding?
Yeah, well, Diane, he made the case that, the former President Maduro, as you referred to him, was not a legitimate president. And that's why the U.S. had that legal authority. Now, we do know other countries are expressing some shock and alarm, saying that, if the United States could do this to one country, what prevents the United States from doing it to other countries and potentially lawfully elected leaders. So we did hear Mike Waltz, Trump's ambassador to the UN, lay out the case saying, look, we're not going to occupy Venezuela. That's not why we're there. This was a law enforcement operation. Now, critics would say, well, it was led by the Army Delta Force. The CIA was involved. This was very much a military operation where we seized a leader of a foreign country. And amazing, we've been pointing out all morning that, just days ago, he was in a presidential palace. And now he's, of course, in this courtroom pleading not guilty, saying that he is not guilty. He was kidnapped And so, we'll see what happens next. But the United States sending a bit of mixed messages. President Trump saying we are in charge of Venezuela now, but hearing from Mike Waltz at the UN just now saying we're not occupying that country. This was simply a law enforcement operation.
Yeah, amazing to think of that contrast of going from the presidential compound to that courtroom and now off to this Brooklyn jail. Brian, Nicolas Maduro has retained attorney Barry Pollock. He previously represented Julian Assange. When you look at his strategy there, does that give you any clues of how he might go about this defense?
Yes and no. If anything, it tells me that this is a seasoned defense attorney who understands working with the federal government on high-profile cases that might also involve various levels of information to secrecy or classified. But in terms of what happened with Julian Assange and Nicolas Maduro, they're almost apple to oranges when it comes to a factual basis. And so, if anything, this request to not provide a bail package or an arraignment argument tells me more than anything else.
All right, Rena Roy, Aaron Katursky, Rachel Scott, Matt Rivers, Ann Flaherty, Brian Buckmeyer, and John Katko. Thank you all. And thank you for watching. I'm Diane Macedo. The news never stops, and neither do we. We have a lot more news right after the break as we follow that vehicle with Nicolas Maduro inside and his wife now heading to a Brooklyn jail. We'll be right back.
Whenever, wherever news breaks, it's so important to always remember that lives are changed.
Here in London, in Buffalo, Uvalde, Texas,
Edinburgh, Scotland.
From Poland once again tonight. Thank you so much for streaming with us. Ukrainian refugees here in Warsaw.
Do you think you'll ever be able to go back home?
We're heading to a small community outside of Mexico City. Splintered houses and splintered lives. And the magnitude of the devastation. You're streaming ABC News Live. Reporting from Rolling Fork, Mississippi. Santa Fe, New Mexico. Raleigh, North Carolina. The U.S. Capitol. Mayfield, Kentucky.
Minneapolis.
Mexico. Tongass National Forest, Alaska.
Getting you behind the stories as they happen. Giving you a front row seat to our world as it plays out in real time, live.
ABC News Live Prime. We'll take you there.
Stream ABC News Live weeknights, America's most honored streaming news program, only on ABC News Live. Streaming free right now wherever you stream your news.
Abby and Libby had gone on a walk, but we went to pick them up. They weren't there.
When the bodies were found, it felt different than any crime scene.
She captured the image of her own murderer.
Capturing their killer, the girls on the high bridge, only on Hulu.
America's #1 news, ABC News, now streaming 24/7 on Disney+. Friday nights at 9 on ABC. Mean true crime.
True murder mystery.
Shocking.
Sex, betrayal, lies. A bombshell. The greatest true crime stories.
2020. Friday nights at 9.
ABC News Live.
Because the news never stops.
This is what you need to know now.
First, the big story.
There is breaking news.
Have you seen this?
Wild.
Wow.
Cool.
Extraordinary. The stories you'll be talking about today.
That is what you need to know. Streaming on Disney+.
2 new episodes weekdays, starting with the day's first news in the morning, then in the afternoon as the news of the day unfolds.
Well, from the luxuries and guarded halls of a palace in Caracas to a federal courtroom in New York City. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kira Phillips. Ousted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife pleading not guilty to all federal charges in federal court as we look at a live look at the convoy holding the ousted president as it makes its way to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. All of this after U.S. military troops swooped in by helicopter and hauled the dictator and his wife to America in handcuffs. The U.S. accusing Maduro of conspiring with vicious drug cartels for the last 25 years. Maduro's son, Nicolas Maduro Guerra, addressing Venezuela's National Assembly today, sending a message to his father that the nation is in good hands while we await your return. Chief Investigative Correspondent Aaron Katursky is outside court in Manhattan. Senior national policy reporter Ann Flaherty also joins us, and legal contributor James Sample. We're going to stay on these live pictures and follow Maduro's journey here back to the detention center. Aaron, you were just there in court. Give us the color, the details on how this arraignment went for Maduro.
It was fairly quick. It was fairly standard, but there were some extraordinary moments, Kira, from the second that Nicolas Maduro walked into the courtroom, which was silent as he came in, shackled in beige pants, black smock over an orange T-shirt. He looked to the spectators gallery and appeared to nod in greeting, saying Buenos dias. He took his seat at the defense table and immediately began scribbling notes. His wife, Cilia Flores, came in after him. She kept her hands folded on the defense table. It did not appear that the husband and wife interacted with one another, although when asked whether they wanted to avail themselves of consular services by the judge, Maduro answered for the both of them and said that they would. As Maduro was asked how he pleads to the charges, he gave something of a soliloquy, or tried to, before the judge cut him off, Kira. He said, "I am innocent. I am not guilty. I am a decent man. I am still president of my country." At that point, Judge Alvin Hellerstein interjected, said there would be time for him to challenge the circumstances leading him here, but he said for now he just wanted to know how he pleaded to the charges, and said a not guilty plea would be entered on his behalf. Kira.
Well, I think there's one thing we can confirm, and he is not leading his country right now. And let's talk about who runs Venezuela from this point on. Trump says it's going to be the U.S. Delcy Rodriguez says, no, she's the leader now.
Yeah, that's obviously the big question. And we've heard from President Trump over the weekend that says we're in charge. But then we heard Secretary Rubio say, no, this is going to be something that we're going to put pressure on the Venezuelan government. They believe, they've given all indications that they could see themselves working with the vice president. But, keep in mind, she was not legitimately elected either, if that's the argument for taking Maduro out of the country. So a lot of questions at this point about exactly what's going to happen next. I know people are drawing parallels to 1989 Panama when Noriega was arrested. But, Kira, that was a situation where the opposition leader was sworn in that night. We don't have a clear path forward when you have the president of the United States saying we're in charge, but the existing government in Venezuela saying we're still here and we still stand by Maduro.
So then, James, let's walk through just the legality of this U.S. raid and this capture. Do you think it's going to help or hurt Maduro's defense?
I doubt, Kira, that it will have a great deal of impact on his defense. I think he's got an extraordinarily tall task ahead of him, and his defense counsel certainly does as well. But that being said, while it may not matter inside the federal courtroom to Maduro, it certainly will matter, the legality that is, to the international community. And there's not much question that as a matter of treaties that the United States has signed, including the United Nations Charter, this abduction of Maduro and transporting him into the United States, because it involved invading the mainland of another sovereign nation, did not fall into any of the three categories that the United Nations recognizes for that kind of an act of force. It wasn't conducted pursuant to consent. There's not really a self-defense rationale. The Trump administration is certainly trying to assert that narco-terrorism and the flow of drugs into the United States is self-defense generating, but that's a reach, and there was no authorization of the UN Security Council. So if it's illegal as a matter of international law, including treaties to which the United States is a party, that makes it illegal under U.S. law as well. However, there is precedent, and Ann mentioned the Noriega parallel. There is precedent there and in a number of other cases that is known as malus captus bene detentes, basically means bad capture, good detention, and that the individual can still be tried no matter the circumstances of his or her capture.
Interesting. And Aaron, you were, I'm seeing the notes now coming through that Maduro there in court said in Spanish, "I'm the elected president. I'm a prisoner of war. I will be free." Let's talk about what happens next.
Well, he's not going to be free. In fact, the defense did not even challenge his detention, at least not yet, though the defense attorney, Barry Pollock, said that he would seek to assert that Maduro was wrongfully snatched by the U.S. military. Whether that has sway with the judge, we'll see. But Maduro does intend to challenge the circumstances of his capture. But for now, will be taken back to MDC in Brooklyn, where he's going to be jailed until his next court appearance on March 17th. As he was being led out of the courtroom, Kira, somebody in the gallery stood up and shouted at him in Spanish, "You will pay." in the name of Venezuela. A court security officer asked the man to leave, but Maduro stopped to respond in Spanish, saying that I am the elected president, and declaring that he would be free.
And as you pointed out, I think he's far from being free, at least for the time being. Aaron Katursky and Flaherty, James Sample, thank you all so much. So now acting President Delcy Rodriguez says that she's running Venezuela. Then you have opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. She says she's the rightful leader. But President Trump says, nope, we're in charge of Venezuela.
Don't ask me who's in charge, because I'll give you an answer and it'll be very controversial.
What does that mean?
It means we're in charge.
Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is dialing back the rhetoric a bit, suggesting the U.S. isn't actually governing the country, but instead imposing a military blockade on oil leaving Venezuela. Here's what he said.
What we are running is the direction that this is going to move moving forward, and that is we have leverage. This leverage we are using and we intend to use. We started using already.
Let's bring in White House correspondent Karen Travers, also national security defense analyst Mick Mulroy, for more on this. So, Karen, what actual role does the U.S. have in Venezuela right now? What do we know for sure?
Yeah, I mean, Kira, listen to those quotes there from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, compared to what we heard from President Trump last night on Air Force One. Clearly, the Secretary of State was trying to dial back some of the president's comments and put it into more diplomatic speak, saying that what the United States is running in Venezuela is the direction that this is moving forward. But he didn't explain exactly what that means. But then hours later, the president was much more blunt, telling reporters that he was going to say something controversial, and then said, it means we're in charge. But as Ann Flaherty in that previous segment was noting, this is not the opposition stepping in at this point, that there is that interim government there, and the vice president, who is now the acting president, Delcy Rodriguez. The president last night was asked if he has spoken to her. He has said he has not, but will at the appropriate time. He also, Kira, issued somewhat of a threat to Rodriguez, saying that if she doesn't cooperate with the United States, she would face a situation worse than what Maduro faced, and he said, quote, Maduro gave up immediately. So certainly not sort of an ominous message sent down there to that acting president, who was, of course, Maduro's handpicked vice president.
Well, Mick Mulroy, I think you can speak from experience. If you see Delta Force swooping in by helicopter and taking you down, you are pretty much going to go easily in a situation like that. Let me ask you about Trump and Rubio, clearly contradicting each other here. What do you make of that?
Well, I think Secretary Rubio is taking the practical approach, right? We don't actually run the country. For example, there's 5 Americans being illegally detained in Venezuela. If we ran the country, they would be coming home right now. But what Secretary Rubio is saying is we can have leverage by this naval blockade, stopping all of the oil tankers, and there's several coming en route right now to Venezuela. We can choke off the regime if they do not do what we would like them to do. And I think that's what he's really talking about as far as whether we're running it or not. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it just means we have influence because of the leverage that we have with our military actions.
So, Mick, what do you think the biggest risks are at this point for Venezuela and also just the region as a whole?
Well, we've heard the administration say that we're going to take the oil. If that is, in fact, the case, it's not just a cooperative effort between the government of Venezuela and U.S. companies, then we're probably going to have to do that by force, at least to secure it. And that would be putting a lot of troops on the ground and right off the coast of Venezuela. That, of course, could lead to a direct military confrontation between U.S. forces and Venezuela forces, because although we've removed Maduro, we have done nothing to change the security situation on the ground. The Venezuelan military still exists. Their paramilitary, which is very violent, still exists as well. So that's the most dangerous situation I think we could see if we elect to do that.
Karen Travers, Mick Mulroy, thanks, guys. We'll be talking all afternoon. From Caracas to Capitol Hill, Now, lawmakers are questioning the legality of that operation in Venezuela. The raid carried out without congressional authorization, and top members weren't even told ahead of time. President Trump's chief of staff saying just weeks ago that any land strikes in Venezuela would require approval by Congress. Our Jay O'Brien has been talking to leaders on the Hill. So, Jay, Secretary Rubio insisting that Congress has limited authority here, calling this a law enforcement operation, not an invasion, even though the military was a major player. So, what are lawmakers telling you?
Yeah, the military was integral to this mission, Kira. In fact, President Trump, when he announced the success of this mission over the weekend, called a, quote, extraordinary military operation. The administration is now trying to frame this as a law enforcement operation, in large part because that would, they say, give Congress much less authority over it than if it were a military operation. Because if it was a law enforcement operation to capture fugitives, as the administration says, there doesn't need to be congressional authorization for military force in Venezuela. Now, even if that's not the case and it's not a law enforcement operation, there's always for years and decades really been this ongoing debate between Congress and the executive branch. How much of a military power does the executive branch, the president, the commander-in-chief have versus Congress, which is the only branch constitutionally able to declare war? But you're exactly right. There's not been a congressional authorization for the use of military force in Venezuela. As you and I just talked about, the president says he doesn't need one because this was a law enforcement operation. But there are still reams of questions that members of Congress have at this hour about, firstly, how this was conducted, and secondly, what is the administration's plan here for the future of Venezuela? I'm told that there's going to be a briefing for top congressional leaders later on this evening of top administration officials, from the Secretary of State to the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General on down, briefing about the operation and, in theory, trying to answer some of those questions about the next steps.
Well, Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, is now the acting president. The White House appears pretty open to her staying in power, Jay. But there is this trio of Florida Republicans backing Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, calling her the next democratically elected president of Venezuela. So how do you see this all playing out? What happens next?
Yeah, they gave a press conference over the weekend in which, in an exchange with a reporter, they said, when there are elections in Venezuela, Maria Machado will be the next leader of that country. Or if they go by the results of the previous election, which evidence shows Machado won and Maduro still clung to power anyway, then she would be the leader of that country. But they hung their comments on the idea that that would only occur after there is this transition. Remember, President Trump has said that there will be a transition of some kind in Venezuela, and as he said over the weekend, the U.S. will, quote-unquote, run the country until that transition is over. But there are vocal Republicans, particularly from South Florida, where this is a critical issue, who have made no secret of the fact that they back Machado to be the next leader of Venezuela.
So much can happen by the minute, that's for sure. Jay O'Brien, thank you so much. Well, he's calling it the Don Roe Doctrine, and now President Trump appears to have set his sights on another territory after the successful operation in Venezuela.
We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security, and Denmark is not going to be able to do it.
So Denmark's prime minister responding to the president, saying Greenland is part of NATO and will be defended by the alliance, urging President Trump to stop the threats. Our foreign correspondent, Tom Soufi-Burridge, is following all that for us. So, Tom, Greenland is, in the president's words, so strategic right now, saying it's covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. What are your thoughts? How are leaders reacting?
Yeah, I want to bring you some comments straight away, Kira, from Mette Frederiksen, some more comments from the Danish Prime Minister. And in an interview on Danish TV, she is being quoted as saying that she believes that anyone should take Donald Trump's threats about wanting Greenland seriously. And then she goes on to say that if the US were to attack Greenland, then she believes that would be the end of the NATO alliance, the end of the security structure, the transatlantic relationship since the end of World War II. Now, Donald Trump has not threatened to attack Greenland, I think it's important to point out, but he has repeatedly said he wants Greenland. And clearly the timing after what's happened in Venezuela, I think, has set more alarm bells ringing across Europe. Look, what is striking, looking at all of the commentary from European leaders who are lining up behind Denmark, because remember, Greenland is an autonomous region of Denmark, European leaders are very much on the same page. They're all saying their support is very much solid for Denmark in this issue, that European sovereignty cannot be threatened by anyone, and that, you know, the NATO alliance is the underpinning, and Denmark is a member of NATO. So, look, European leaders are struggling with the unorthodoxy of the Trump administration on multiple issues, on Ukraine, on Greenland, on the US national security strategy, which was published at the end of last year, which really, you know, ripped up the rulebook in terms of the US relationship with Europe and basically said that the US administration under Donald Trump was going to push for more nationalist governments in Europe. So if you're Viktor Orban in Hungary, you're pretty happy at what's happening. If you are most European leaders right across this continent, they are very worried, they're very concerned, but they are very careful with their words, because any European leader never wants to upset any US administration, including the Trump administration. So, you know, they are lining up behind Denmark, but they're also being careful not to say anything too provocative to upset the US, who ultimately they still rely on for security in this continent.
Tom Sufi-Burridge, thank you. Well, coming up, from VP nominee to out of a job, why Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is suspending his bid for re-election. Plus, J.D. Vance's home in Ohio under attack, what we know about the man who allegedly took a hammer to the vice president's windows.
I'd never seen that many skeletal remains. Thousands. It's a serial killer case.
This killer, he's the dumber you've never heard of.
More and more men are going missing, and then the lead broke the case open. They discovered the farm.
The whole place was so bizarre.
There were mannequins, almost like it was a club.
I felt the presence of evil.
The largest number of unidentified human remains, second only to the World Trade Center.
Not many people live to tell about their involvement with the serial killer.
Everything we know about this case comes from you.
Absolutely. Let's not do that.
Ooh, I'm sorry.
Never before a face-to-face interview with a camera.
Why now?
Let me ask you, am I the evil culprit, the accomplice? I'd like to know how the audience views me.
The Fox Hollow Murders, Playground of a Serial Killer. Only on Hulu.
Tell a joke.
I think I'm getting a divorce. What tipped me off was living in an apartment on my own.
Doesn't have to be awkward, right?
I've been doing open mic nights.
Is it like a hobby?
It's actually pretty amazing.
Are you gonna be okay?
I'm gonna be okay. Doing this, it helps.
How does it help to have a room full of people laughing at you?
Is this thing on? Rated R.
My friends think I'm crazy.
College is the most unserious part of your life.
He's not someone who lets things go. Why are you doing this?
Because I want to hurt you, and I don't know how else to do it.
I just really feel like things are going to be different this time.
Well, he was nominated for vice president. Now he says he's giving up as governor. Minnesota's Tim Walz